Not too long ago, I made a Chevron cutting board and I really liked how it turned out. I was also excited just to see what else I could do with that. So today I'll be making another Chevron cutting board, but I'm going to change the angles as well as the wood I use. So I will be using this slab of English walnut and mahogany. Let's get started. I started out with the bandsaw, just cutting off the live edge from the black walnut. I used a straight edge to draw a straight line just to make sure that I was cutting a straight line. Then I took it over to the jointer just to get a flat edge to start off with. Then I took it back to the bandsaw and I cut it into just slightly over 1-inch pieces. I could have used the table saw, but I just don't really feel comfortable with the blade up that high, so the bandsaw works great for me. And once I was done, I prepped the boards for running through the planer. The bandsaw left some rough edges, so I ran all of these boards through the planer to get rid of all of the rough, jagged edges and also just to make sure that they were all the same thickness. This is really important when making a cutting board because you want to make sure that those pieces fit really tight together. Then using the jointer, I got one flat edge on all of the boards. Just to give me another flat edge to work with when cutting them down further to size. And using the bandsaw, I just cut these into just over 1-inch strips. I once again prepped these boards to run through the planer. Now the mahogany was already dimensioned, so I didn't need to do too much work here. So I ran it through the table saw at just slightly over 1 inch so that it would give me the height of the cutting board and I could just put them up on end. And using the miter saw, I cut them down to size. Using the bandsaw, I cut these boards in half. Now you can use the table saw for something like this, but just because these strips were smaller than my push stick and it just gets tricky when I'm pushing it through. So for me, it was easier to use the bandsaw. And I ran these through the planer as well. And now to the glue up. So I used a different product this time. I actually used a Titebond waterproof. I thought this would be something good to try out since these cutting boards get wet often, but I will let you know how that goes. And you'll probably see that my glue up method is just slightly different here too. I'm gluing up each board at a time rather than laying them all out. And that is just because with the boards being different thicknesses, it was too hard to do them all at once. So this process did take me a little longer to do, but overall it's the same as I normally do. I made sure to get glue on all of the edges just to make sure that it had a nice tight seal. And after I put on my last piece comes the clamping. I use the mallet and a piece of wood just to make sure to flatten down any of the wood that's popped up during my clamping. So I actually clamped the board to either side and to the workbench just to make sure that the wood would stay flat and none of it came up. And I left it to dry overnight. Oh shoot. And I didn't think this one through. It is too big to run through the planer. So instead, I got my sharpest hand plane, which happened to be a block plane. Not really ideal, but it did the trick. Luckily, this didn't need to be perfect. I just needed to get it as flat as possible before I recut and re-glued up. I actually ended up using both hands because let me tell you, this is a tiring process. People that use hand planes all the time, they must be really strong. And using the miter saw, I cut a 15-degree cut. This gave me a flat edge to use on the table saw. And putting that 15-degree side against the fence, I cut just slightly over 1-inch pieces. Then I arranged the pieces how I thought they looked best. And to get that chevron pattern, I just flipped over every other board. Again, I laid down the parchment paper and I put the pieces on. And this time you'll see the glue up was a lot easier. Since they're the same thickness, I was able to just glue them up all at the same time. And I just leave my end piece off to the side. Otherwise, I tend to forget and I put glue on it and it just becomes a goopy mess to try and clamp together. And during this process, I make sure that my chevron pattern is going together correct, because once you push that piece together, it's hard to pull it apart and you don't want your chevron to have areas where it doesn't line up. So make sure when you're putting it together that you are paying attention to the pattern and make sure to line it up correctly. Again, using a piece of wood and the mallet just to make sure that none of the wood has come up during clamping. And I used a wet rag just to try to remove as much of the glue as possible. And after letting it dry overnight, it's good to go. On the miter saw, I just cut off the edges. Now this would make a great square cutting board that's very large. However, I decided to make 2 separate cutting boards instead, so you see me cutting it in half. And now it fits in my planer. Yay, no more hand planing. Using my router and my 1/8 inch roundover bit, I rounded over all of the edges. So I started off with an 80 grit sandpaper, and it took me about 35 minutes on each board to start with. Now that's just getting out all of the marks from the planer and any unevenness on the boards. Then from there I move up to 100 grit. And I want to say that takes about 3 minutes, maybe 4 minutes. And at this point, I move up to 150 grit before I get the cutting boards wet. And the reason for this is just to bring up that grain so that the first time somebody uses their cutting board, it doesn't feel rough. Back to the sanding, starting with 220 grit sandpaper. And I worked up through the grits to 600 grit sandpaper for these. Using the same jig that I used on my last cutting board, I pre-drilled for the feet. Then I screwed the feet on, just tight enough so that they weren't moving around, but I didn't want them so tight that it was digging into the cutting board. Then I used my air compressor just to remove all of the dust before finishing. Now what you see, the marks on the cutting boards right now, was that I just had some Odie's oil on my hand when I put them up on the workbench. And here I am using Odie's oil. I'm just rubbing it in and getting it all over the cutting board. Then I leave it on for 20 hours and come out and remove any of the excess and really buff it into the cutting board. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future builds.